The Union Pacific came in 3 hours late. It always did this time of year when the September heat baked the rails until the metal groaned and expanded, and the whole machine slowed down like a tired animal that had been pushed too hard for too long. Black smoke hung in the still air over Millerton Station long before the train itself appeared, a dark smear against the pale Wyoming sky that told everyone on the platform exactly what was coming and exactly when it would arrive. Clara Ashford had been watching that smoke for 20 minutes through the passenger car window. She had her forehead pressed against the glass, and the glass was hot from the sun, and she let it burn because the small pain kept her mind sharp and her eyes clear. The platform materialized slowly through the coal haze. Buildings first, then people, then faces. She counted them. 30, maybe 40. More than she had expected for a town this size. Men in work clothes and men in suits, and women with parasols standing in careful clusters, the way people cluster when they have come to see something they are not entirely sure they should want to see. There was a quality to that kind of crowd that Clara had learned to recognize over the past 3 months. It was the quality of people who had decided in advance what they thought about you. She sat back from the window. Her carpet bag sat on her lap. It was not a large bag. It did not need to be. Everything she owned in the world fit inside it with room to spare. 2 dresses, both faded from washing. A hairbrush with half its bristles missing, kept because it had been her mother's and she could not make herself throw it away. A small book of poetry she had bought in Chicago 2 years ago when she still believed she would have quiet evenings to read in. Her mother's wedding ring on a silver chain she wore under her collar, where no one could see it. She had been wearing that ring since she was 14 years old. The night her father had come home drunk and gone through her mother's things, she had already tucked it into the toe of a boot, 3 days before he arrived, because even at 14 she had understood what kind of man her father was becoming. He had found the brooch, the small cameo her mother had worn at her collar, ivory and gold, worth more than he got for it. She had watched him sell it for $11 in a pawn shop on Wabash Avenue, and he had told her it was necessary, and she had believed him because she had still been at 14 capable of believing him. She had learned. The ring stayed, hidden first in the boot, then in the lining of a coat, then on its chain against her skin, where it had remained ever since, where no one could think to take it. And at the bottom of the bag, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath a false lining, she had sewn herself with her own unsteady hands on a train platform in Chicago, while her father stood 10 feet away and refused to look at her, were the papers. The contract. 5 pages of legal language witnessed and notarized and filed with the territorial clerk in Denver that made her, in the careful phrasing of American law, a contract servant for the period of 5 years from the date of signing, said service to be rendered to one Hiram Cadell of Millerton, Wyoming Territory, in exchange for the settlement of debts incurred by her father, one Robert Ashford, formerly of Chicago, Illinois. Formerly, that was the word they had used, as though her father had already ceased to exist, had already been erased from the record of things, which in a way he had. He had taken it as one-way ticket in his relieved face and his inability to meet her eyes, and he had gone west on a different train toward a different life, and Clara had not watched him go, because watching him go would have required her to feel something she could not afford to feel. She had been feeling nothing for 3 months. It was easier that way. The train lurched to a stop. Steam hissed from the release valves with a sound like something enormous exhaling. The car shuddered once, twice, then went still. Clara's hands tightened on the worn handles of the carpet bag. Her knuckles went pale. She had told herself during 3 days of travel that she was prepared. She had constructed a version of arrival in her mind, had rehearsed it the way you rehearse anything you are terrified of, until the repetition wore down the sharp edges and made it feel survivable. A man would be waiting. He would be older, probably. He would look at her the way a man looks at a purchase he is not entirely sure about. She would be quiet and careful, and she would find the edges of what was expected of her, and she would work within those edges, and she would survive. That was the plan. That was all the plan she had. She had not planned for what came next. The conductor opened the rear door of the car. Heat rolled in like something alive, like a physical presence that pushed past her and filled the space around her and made it suddenly harder to breathe. Clara stood. Her legs shook. She made them stop through the simple force of refusing to let them continue, and she walked down the aisle with her spine straight and her chin level and her face arranged into an expression that revealed nothing, because she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break before they had even started. She stepped down onto the platform, and the crowd turned. All of them, all at once. 40 pairs of eyes moving toward her with the smooth, practiced certainty of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. She felt the attention like weather, like a front moving in, and she stood in it and let it happen, and stared at a point 6 inches above the nearest head and breathed. A woman in a purple dress with a parasol said something to the woman standing beside her. Both of them laughed. It was a particular kind of laugh, the kind that is designed to be heard. Clara looked at the boards beneath her feet. There were knots in the grain of the wood. She counted them, 7 visible from where she stood. She focused on that number with the concentration of someone disarming something dangerous. A man detached himself from the crowd and came toward her. Thin, gray-suited, carrying a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, spectacles perched on a narrow nose. He moved with the efficient, slightly apologetic energy of a man who spent his professional life delivering news that other people did not want to hear. He stopped 3 feet from her, consulted a paper from his portfolio, looked up. Clara Ashford. It was not a question. Clara nodded once. I'm Amos Finch, attorney at law. He adjusted his spectacles. I represent the estate of the late Hiram Cadell. Late. The word registered the way a stone registers when it drops into still water. Slowly at first, then the ripples spreading outward. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Late, she said. Mr. Cadell passed 4 days ago. Stroke. Very sudden. Finch's voice held no particular emotion. He was a man performing a difficult task with professional courtesy, and he had the decency not to dress it up. His affairs are being settled according to his will. The crowd had drawn closer. She could feel them tightening around her like a fist. Clara looked at Finch. What does that mean for the contract? The contract is a legal instrument attached to the estate. He opened his portfolio. Under the terms of Mr. Cadell's will, the contract transfers to the designated heir, or failing that, reverts to the primary creditor. He paused. In this case, the Millerton First Bank. He glanced past her shoulder. The bank is currently represented by its owner. The woman in the purple dress stepped forward. She was tall, rigidly corseted, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked as though it caused her physical discomfort. She moved through the crowd the way water moves around stones without effort, without acknowledgement that the stones exist. She stopped in front of Clara and looked at her the way you look at an animal at auction, the measuring clinical assessment of someone calculating whether the purchase price is justified by what stands before them. You're younger than I expected, the woman said, and thinner. Clara held the woman's gaze. I was not aware my dimensions were part of the arrangement. Something shifted in the woman's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. I'm Eleanor Pettigrew. The name came out like a statement of ownership. This is my town, more or less, and that, she gestured toward Finch's portfolio without looking at it, is my concern now. She turned to Finch. Read the relevant portion. Finch cleared his throat, found the page, read without inflection. In the matter of contract servant Clara Ashford, the contract shall pass to any responsible party willing to assume the debt of $848 within 24 hours of my death. Failing such assumption, the contract reverts to the Millerton First Bank as primary creditor. He looked up. That sum includes the original purchase price of $800 plus accumulated interest at 6% per annum over the period of 3 months. Do you have the means to pay this sum and void the contract, Miss Ashford? Clara said nothing. Then you remain bound. Finch closed the portfolio. Mrs. Pettigrew holds the right to claim the contract on behalf of the bank, or we can offer it to any interested party at the stated sum. He raised his voice to address the crowd. Is there anyone present willing to assume this contract for $848? Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that settles on your shoulders and your chest and makes the simple act of standing upright feel like labor. Clara stared at the boards beneath her feet, the knots in the grain, 7 of them. She counted them again. A man near the back of the crowd called out, What kind of work is she suited for? Domestic service, Finch said. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, basic farm work. Another voice, rougher. She looks strong enough to me. Laughter moved through the crowd like a wave. Clara felt her face burn. She fixed her eyes on the boards and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and did not move and did not react and gave them nothing because that was the only form of resistance available to her and she would use it until it was taken away. Eleanor Pettigrew's voice cut through the noise. I'll give 600, cash today. Finch frowned. The contract specifies 848, Mrs. Pettigrew. For damaged goods. Eleanor's tone had the flat precision of someone accustomed to setting prices and having them accepted. The girl arrives alone, unchaperoned, after traveling across half the country unescorted. Her reputation is compromised at minimum. 600 is generous. She's not damaged. The voice came from the edge of the crowd. Male, deep and quiet, with an edge beneath the quiet, the way a river has an edge beneath its surface, something moving fast and cold in the dark water below. She's a person, not livestock. Clara's head came up. She could not see him yet. The crowd was too thick, people standing shoulder to shoulder, and then they weren't because they were stepping back one by one, creating a path the way people create paths for things that make them uncertain. She heard boots on the platform boards, a deliberate sound, unhurried. Then he was there. He stepped into the open space between Clara and Eleanor Pettigrew with the measured ease of a man who has walked into dangerous situations enough times that the walking itself no longer frightens him, even when what waits at the other end still might. He was tall, 6 feet or more, lean in the way of men who have worked hard for a long time and eaten simply and asked nothing of their bodies except that they continue to function. His face was weathered in the way that Wyoming weathers, everything lines carved deep around his eyes and the corners of his mouth, dark hair going gray at the temples beneath a battered hat pulled low against the September sun. He wore range clothes, work clothes, the kind that had been washed many times and dried in the wind and retained no particular shape except the shape of the man inside them. But it was his eyes that stopped her, pale blue, the color of sky just after sunrise before the day has fully committed to itself, and carrying something in them that she recognized because she saw it in her own reflection every morning in every inadequate mirror she had passed in front of for the past 3 months. Guilt. Bone-deep old, the kind that has been carried so long that it no longer announces itself, just exists as a permanent condition of being, the way a limp exists long after the original injury has healed. He looked at Finch. He did not look at Eleanor. What's the sum again? $848, Finch said. He studied the stranger over his spectacles. Mr. Mercer, I did not expect to see you in town. Mercer, Clara filed the name carefully, the way you file things you may need to retrieve quickly. She watched him reach inside his coat, watched him pull out a leather wallet worn smooth at the edges from long use, watched him open it and begin laying bills on the leather cover of Finch's portfolio with steady hands. Hundreds, 50s, 20s, each one placed flat and deliberate. The crowd had gone completely quiet. Eleanor Pettigrew's face had changed. The composed authority was still there, the surface of it, but beneath the surface something was moving. Something that looked like calculation, moving toward panic, the expression of a person who has been playing a game they expected to win and has just realized the board has more pieces on it than they accounted for. Wyatt Mercer, her voice was sharp, you have no business interfering in this matter. Mercer kept counting, 820, 840, 848. He pushed the stack across to Finch and looked at it rather than at Eleanor. That cover it. Finch stared at the money. He swallowed. This is highly irregular, but legal. Mercer's voice was quiet, completely quiet, the kind of quiet that is more unsettling than any raised voice. A man offering to assume a contract debt within the specified time frame. That's what the will says. Finch looked at Eleanor. Eleanor was gripping her parasol hard enough that the handle creaked in the still September air. Her mouth opened, closed. She was calculating. Clara could see it happening, the rapid assessment of a woman who understood power and money and the precise moments when fighting costs more than retreating. Technically, Finch said slowly, with the careful precision of a man stepping across uncertain ground, yes. If the sum is paid in full, the contract transfers immediately to the paying party. He began gathering the bills with fingers that were not entirely steady. I'll need to count this. Count away. Mercer finally looked at Eleanor. His expression did not change. Not a muscle of his face moved, but something in his pale eyes shifted, and it was enough. Eleanor took one step back without appearing to decide to do so, as though her body had made the decision before her mind could argue. "I believe our business is concluded, Mrs. Pettigrew. This is unconscionable." Her voice shook with something that might have been rage, might have been something closer to fear. "You're taking advantage of a desperate situation for your own purposes. I'm paying a legal debt." A pause. "What you were planning to do with it, that's between you and your conscience." He let that sentence stand by itself. Eleanor turned on her heel and walked away through the crowd, her back straight, her parasol held at the correct angle, every inch of her bearing announcing that she was leaving by her own choice, and not because she had been outmaneuvered, though she had been, and everyone on the platform knew it. The crowd began to disperse. The entertainment was over. Or maybe it was just beginning, depending on how you understood these things. Finch finished counting the money, placed it in his portfolio, and produced another document and a pen. "Mr. Mercer, I'll need your signature transferring the contract. And yours, Miss Ashford, acknowledging the transfer of your service obligation." Clara found her voice. It was steadier than she felt. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" Mercer signed the document Finch held out, slid it across to her without looking at her directly. "We'll discuss it at the ranch." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting right now." He nodded toward her bag. "That all you brought?" "Yes." "Then let's go." He started walking. Clara looked at Finch. The lawyer shrugged a small, resigned gesture that said very clearly that he had been a lawyer long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything. "You're legally bound to him now, Miss Ashford. For 5 years, I suggest you follow." She picked up her bag. Her hands were shaking again, and this time she could not make them stop, so she did not try. She walked through the thinning crowd past the whispers and the stares, and the woman in the purple dress who watched her go, with an expression that promised this was not finished out, to where a buckboard wagon waited in the shade of the depot overhang. A dun horse dozed in the traces, one ear forward and one ear back. Mercer took her bag from her and set it in the wagon bed without asking. Then he turned and offered his hand to help her up. Clara stopped. She looked at the hand, calloused palm, rope-scarred fingers. The hand of a man who had spent years doing physical work in difficult conditions, who had asked hard things of those hands, and they had done them. There was a scar along the outside of the right thumb, old and white curved, like a question mark. She took the hand. His grip was firm and brief. He released her the moment she was seated and walked around to climb up on his side and picked up the reins, and they rolled forward. The town fell behind them. The prairie opened up ahead. Endless, gold and brown under the September sun, the grass moving in a slow wind that carried the smell of sage and dry earth, and the distant suggestion of something colder coming down from the north. The sky was the kind of blue that exists only at altitude and only in late summer, so deep and clear that looking at it for too long made something ache behind your breastbone. They rode in silence for a mile, 2 miles, 3. Clara watched the road unspool before the horse's ears and tried to understand what had just happened, tried to construct a version of it that made sense. A stranger had watched her stand on a platform while a crowd debated her worth, and then he had reached into his coat and paid nearly $900 for her contract, and now they were riding together into the open country, and he had not explained himself, and she had no idea where she was going or what waited for her when she arrived. At the 3-mile marker, a weathered post leaning slightly to the east, she decided she could not wait any longer. "Why?" The horse's ears moved. Mercer kept his eyes on the road. "Why what? Why did you buy my contract? Why did you pay that much money for someone you've never met?" The road rattled the wagon over a series of ruts and settled again. A hawk turned slow circles in the sky above them, riding the thermals without effort, watching the ground below, with the patient attention of something that has learned to wait. "Because you needed help." "That's not a reason. That's an excuse. Va so." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he was simply going to refuse to answer. The wagon rolled on. The prairie stretched. Then he spoke. "5 years ago, I was a deputy U.S. Marshal out of Cheyenne." His voice was flat, the way voices get flat when they are recounting things that have been recounted so many times in private that all the feeling has been worn away, leaving only the bare structure of the facts. My last assignment was tracking a gang that had killed 4 people in a bank robbery outside Laramie. We found them. There was a shootout. A pause. I killed 3 of them. The 4th surrendered. My partner and I brought him in. Everything by the book. Legal, clean, documented. Clara watched his profile. The set of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins, not tight, not loose. 2 months later, I found out one of the men I'd killed wasn't part of the gang. The words came out the same as the others, same flat tone, but Clara felt the weight behind them. He was a Pinkerton agent working undercover. His name was Thomas Bridger. He had a wife, 2 small children, and I put a bullet through his chest because I thought he was an outlaw. The hawk had stopped circling. It dropped behind a rise and disappeared. It was ruled justified, Mercer said. Line of duty, no charges filed. The investigation found no evidence of wrongdoing. He paused, but Bridger's family didn't accept that ruling. They hired investigators, and those investigators found things that made it look less clean. Made it look like maybe I had known who Bridger was, maybe I had reasons to want him dead that had nothing to do with the law. Clara's hands were still in her lap. Did you know who he was? The silence stretched between them, thin and taut. Yeah, I knew. She sat with that. I resigned, Mercer said. Came back out here. This ranch belonged to my wife's family. She passed 6 years ago. Diphtheria took our boy too. He was 6 years old. He stopped, swallowed. The sound of it was audible over the creak of the wagon. I've been alone here since then, working the land, staying out of sight, trying to figure out if a man can ever outrun what he's done. He looked at her then, for the first time since they had sat down together, pale eyes meeting hers directly with the exhausted steadiness of someone who has stopped trying to manage how they appear. I saw you standing on that platform. 40 people looking at you like you were something to be priced and parceled out. And I saw myself 5 years ago, except I had a choice about what I was going to become. You didn't. A pause. So I made a different choice. This time, the wagon rolled on. Maybe it doesn't fix anything. Maybe it's just a man trying to buy his way into feeling human again. But it's done now. Clara looked at the road ahead, at the grass moving in the wind, at the long, quiet distance of the country around them. She had one more question, the only one that mattered. What do you want from me? Nothing you're not willing to give. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded paper, held it out to her, without looking away from the road. She took it. I wrote that last night, he said, after I heard about Cadell dying. Read it when you're ready. She unfolded it. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. The handwriting of a man who had learned to write well and use that skill sparingly. She read it slowly. The first clause stated the duration of her service, 5 years, consistent with the original contract. The second specified the nature of the work: domestic labor, farm work, general ranch operations. Standard language for what she had expected. Then the contract changed. Separate living quarters maintained and provided at no cost to her. A salary of $20 monthly beginning after the first year, held in trust until the end of the contract period or her departure, whichever came first. No physical contact of any kind without her explicit and freely given consent under any circumstances. The contract voidable by either party if any of its terms were breached. She read those clauses twice. Then she reached the final paragraph. It was written in slightly different ink, as though it had been added after the rest, after some deliberation or change of mind. She read it 3 times before the meaning settled. Upon completion of 5 years of service, or upon mutual agreement to dissolve the contract before that period, Clara Ashford shall receive full legal deed to 100 acres of Mercer Ranch land, free and clear of any encumbrance, as compensation for services rendered and in recognition of her inherent human dignity. Her inherent human dignity. She read those 4 words again. She looked up at Wyatt Mercer, at the side of his face, at the lines around his eyes, at the gray in his hair that had probably come in all at once, the way grief does some things all at once. This isn't a contract for servitude, she said. No. What is it? He kept his eyes on the road for a moment. Then he said simply, it's a contract for partnership, if you'll sign it. The ranch appeared as they crested a long rise. It was larger than she had expected. A main house 2 stories weathered gray wood that had once been painted white and still held the ghost of that color in the sheltered angles. A smaller cabin set back from the main house by perhaps 50 yards solid and square, with a window facing east. Corrals a barn with a slight sag on one side that had not yet become a problem, but would. Fields that had seen better seasons but were not dead. Cattle visible in the far pasture, white-faced Herefords moving slowly through the brown grass. And in the distance, at the edge of a stand of cottonwoods, barely visible from the road, but there if you knew to look. 3 small mounds of earth, wooden markers. Mercer saw where she was looking. "My family," he said quietly. "Anna, Michael," a pause. "And the grave I dug for Thomas Bridger, even though his body is in Denver. Seemed like the right thing to do. Give him a place to rest out here where I'd have to look at it every day." The wagon stopped in front of the main house. Mercer climbed down, retrieved her bag from the wagon bed, carried it to the porch of the smaller cabin, and set it there. Then he turned. "That's yours," he said. "I'm in the main house. There's a lock on your door." He reached into his pocket and held out a small iron key. "Only you have one." Clara stepped down from the wagon. She stood in the yard of this ranch in the middle of Wyoming territory, 900 miles from everything she had known, holding a key in one hand and a contract in the other. The September sun was warm on her face. The sage smell was strong and clean. She turned the key over in her palm, looked at it, then looked at him. "What happens now?" she asked. He was already walking toward the barn, leading the dun horse by the reins, not looking back. "Well, now you decide if you can live with this arrangement, and I figure out if buying your contract was the worst mistake I've made or the first right thing I've done in 5 years." He disappeared into the barn. Clara stood alone in the yard. She looked at the key, at the contract, at the cabin with its east-facing window, at the main house with its ghost of white paint and its photographs she had not yet seen, at the 3 small mounds of earth at the edge of the trees. She picked up her bag and walked inside. The cabin was one room, maybe 12 feet square, a narrow bed with a corn husk mattress and a single wool blanket, gray with washing. A table scarred with knife marks and water rings. 1 chair, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, cold. A window east-facing cracked in one corner, intact. The floor had been swept recently. The broom marks were still visible in the dust. She set her bag on the bed. The ropes creaked. Dust motes rose in the late afternoon light, slanting through the cracked window. She sat beside the bag and pressed both hands flat on her thighs and breathed. 3 months ago, she had been a woman with a future, a teaching position at a girls' school on the north side of Chicago. A small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of other people's cooking, which she had not minded. A modest salary that covered food and rent and left enough for a book now and then. A life that was not large by any measure, but was entirely and completely hers. Then her father had knocked on her door at midnight. The smell of whiskey had come in ahead of him. She remembered that detail with a clarity that surprised her, still the specific quality of that smell on that particular night, because it was the last ordinary moment she had before everything changed. And then he had told her, sitting in her one good chair while she stood in the middle of the room, still in her nightgown, still holding the lamp she had brought to the door. "I sold your contract to settle the debt," like it was the simplest transaction in the world, like it was simply the obvious solution to a problem he had created, like she had always been in his understanding of things, an asset to be liquidated when necessary. She had not cried. She remembered that too. She had looked at him, at his red face and his red hands and his inability to hold her gaze, and she had felt something go very still inside her, some last fragile structure settle into the cold permanence of fact. Clara pulled the contract from her pocket and read it again. 100 acres, her own lock, her own key, and $20 a month. What kind of man bought a woman's servitude and then gave her a key for her door? A guilty one. A man trying to balance a scale that could not be balanced because the weight on one side was a dead man, and the weight on the other side was whatever a man like Wyatt Mercer could offer a stranger in September on a Wyoming platform. She folded the contract carefully. She stood and unpacked her bag with the methodical efficiency of someone who had unpacked into small spaces many times. 2 dresses on nails beside the bed, the hairbrush on the table. The wedding ring stayed on its chain against her skin. At the bottom, wrapped in its oilcloth, she found the original contract, the one with the territorial seal and the notary's signature, and her own signature, and her father's signature, all legally binding, all perfectly civilized, all describing the same thing in language, careful enough to make it seem like something other than what it was. She took it to the stove, opened the iron door, looked at it. She could not burn it. Not yet. It was evidence. The only documentation she had of her own history, the only thing standing between her and being called a liar, if anyone ever questioned her account of how she came to be here. She rewrapped it carefully and tucked it under the mattress between the rope supports where the shadows were deepest. A knock at the door made her jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She put her back against the wall and breathed. "It's Mercer." His voice came through the thin wood, muffled but recognizable. She opened the door. He stood on the threshold with a bucket. Steam rose from the water inside. He held it out and waited, not moving to step past the threshold, not looking past her into the room. "Water's hot," he said. "Thought you'd want to wash up before supper." She took the bucket. Their fingers did not touch. He had been careful about that. "Thank you." He nodded once and turned and walked back to the main house with the set of shoulders she would come to recognize, over time the posture of a man carrying weight he had stopped trying to put down because he no longer believed it was possible. Clara washed her face and hands until her skin felt raw, changed into her brown dress, the less stained of the two, braided her hair and pinned it up, found a fragment of mirror propped against the wall and looked at herself. The woman looking back was a stranger, not in an unfamiliar way. In the way of someone you have known so long, you stop seeing them clearly, and then something changes and you see them again, and you have to decide whether what you see is someone you recognize or someone you have to introduce yourself to. She crossed the yard as the sun touched the horizon. The main house was larger up close, wide porch, windows that hadn't been washed in months. She knocked. The door opened. She stepped inside and stopped. This was a home that had been loved once and then abandoned to slow and patient decay. A stone fireplace on the far wall, cold now, but with recent ash in the grate. Furniture that had been fine, once sagging, now faded. A rag rug on the floor whose colors had gone gray with age. And on the mantel in frames thick with dust, photographs. A woman with kind eyes and dark hair, looking directly at the camera with an expression of quiet confidence, as though she knew exactly what she was and had made her peace with it long ago. A small boy, maybe 5, grinning with a gap where his front teeth should be, the pure, unself-conscious joy of a child who has not yet learned that joy can be taken away. And Wyatt Mercer, younger less, lined his arm around the woman's shoulders and his hand on the boy's shoulder, actually smiling. Actually completely, entirely smiling. Clara looked away. It felt like reading someone else's mail. Mercer was at the stove stirring something in a pot. The smell of beans and salt pork filled the room. He glanced at her briefly. "Sit anywhere, supper's almost ready." She chose a chair at the table. He moved without wasted motion. Ladled beans into 2 bowls, cut bread from a loaf that was going stale, poured coffee the color and consistency of river mud, brought it to the table and sat across from her. They ate. The beans were plain, under-seasoned. The bread was hard at the edges. The coffee was nearly undrinkable. Clara ate everything in her bowl. She had learned not to waste food. When the bowls were empty, Mercer collected them and carried them to the basin by the stove. He washed them in silence, his back to her, scrubbing each bowl with the focused intensity of a man who is giving his hands something to do so his mind does not have to stop. "Tomorrow I'll show you the ranch," he said without turning. "How things work. After that, you decide how you want to divide the labor. I'm not particular about who does what as long as it gets done." "All right. There are chickens. Garden's mostly gone to seed, but there might be some squash left. 6 head of cattle." He set the bowls to dry. Turned. "I know this isn't what you expected." Clara met his gaze. "I stopped expecting things 3 months ago." He studied her face. "What happened 3 months ago?" "My father gambled away more money than he could pay. The men he owed gave him a choice. His life or my contract." A pause. "He chose his life." Mercer stood very still. "Simple as that," Clara said. He crossed to a cabinet on the far wall, opened it, and retrieved something wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the table between them, unwrapped it. A revolver, short-barreled, well-maintained, the metal gleaming in the lamplight with the attention that tools receive from people who understand what tools are for. You know how to use one of these? No. I'll teach you tomorrow. He wrapped it back up and pushed it across the table toward her. Keep it in your cabin, wherever you can reach it fast. You see anyone you don't know, anyone who makes you uneasy, you use it. Clara looked at the wrapped gun. I thought you said I was safe here. You are, from me. His voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. I can't guarantee safe from whoever your father owes. This is Wyoming territory. The law is a long ride away most days. You need to be able to protect yourself. She reached out and touched the oilcloth. The gun underneath was solid, real in the way that few things had felt real to her in the past 3 months. Why are you doing this? She looked up at him. You own my contract. I'm legally bound to you. Most men in your position would make sure I couldn't fight back. Something moved across Mercer's face, not offense, not anger, something quieter and more final than either. I'm not most men. A pause. And if you ever need to fight back, I want you to win. The words sat between them in the lamplight. Clara picked up the wrapped revolver and stood. I should go, it's late. Mercer nodded. She was at the door when he spoke again. Clara. She turned. He was standing at the table with his hands at his sides, looking at her with those pale eyes that carried their permanent cargo of old guilt. That contract I gave you. I meant every word of it. A pause. You're not a servant here. You're a partner. It might not feel that way yet, but that's what you are. And if you ever want to leave, if this arrangement doesn't work for you, you tell me. I'll tear up the contract, give you enough money to get wherever you want to go. No questions. Clara's throat tightened. Why would you do that? Because I know what it's like to be trapped by choices other people made. He looked down at his hands. I won't do that to someone else, not if I can help it. She left without answering, crossed the yard in the cooling September dark. The stars were coming out, more of them than she had ever seen from Chicago, more than she had believed could exist in one skyline. The Milky Way arched overhead like something impossibly permanent and impossibly fragile at the same time. She went into the cabin, locked the door, set the wrapped revolver on the table, lit the lamp Mercer had left there. The wick caught and yellow light pushed back the dark. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself shake. Let all of it move through her, the fear and the confusion, and the 3 months of held breath, and the strange, dangerous, completely irrational thing that was beginning to form at the edges of her understanding, something that resembled hope in its general outline, even if she was not yet willing to give it that name. She had expected a tyrant, had prepared for cruelty and contempt, for the 1,000 small degradations that came with being owned. Instead, she had found a man who cooked terrible beans and washed his own dishes and left a bucket of hot water on her threshold without being asked, and could not look at photographs of his dead family without carrying them in his face afterward. A man who had killed someone and could not forgive himself for it. A man who was in his own particular way exactly as trapped as she was, just in a different kind of cage. Clara lay down without undressing, stared at the ceiling in the lamplight. She was still thinking about the photographs on the mantel, the woman with the kind eyes and the small boy with the gap-toothed grin when it came. Past midnight, the sound carrying across the quiet yard from the direction of the main house, faint at first, then unmistakable. Not an animal, not the wind, a man crying, deep wrenching sounds that had clearly been contained for a long time before tonight. The sound of grief that has stopped, pretending to be anything other than what it is. Clara got up. She went to the window, stood at the edge of it where she would not be visible from outside. The main house was dark except for one window on the second floor, a warm square of lamplight against the black, and inside that light a shadow moving. Pacing, stopping, pacing again. She watched for a long time. The crying eventually stopped. The lamp went out. The house went dark. Clara stood at the window for a while longer, looking at the outline of the building against the stars, at the 3 small mounds of earth, at the edge of the cottonwoods, at the prairie beyond them, that went on until it became the horizon, and the horizon became the sky. Then she went back to bed. Sleep came. It brought dreams she did not want. Her father's face. The Chicago courtroom where a judge had signed his name to a document that made her property. The men on the platform and their particular kind of laughter. But running through all of it quieter than the rest, a question that had no answer yet. What did you do, Wyatt Mercer, that you are trying so hard to undo? And underneath that question, something she could not yet name. The first pale light of morning was already gathering at the edge of the east-facing window when Clara finally slept. The roosters found her an hour later. She woke to their noise in the smell of wood smoke in September light clear and gold and completely indifferent to the trouble of the human beings it illuminated. She dressed, braided her hair, picked up the revolver from the table where she had left it and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the solid and specific fact of it. Then she unlocked the door and stepped out into the morning. Wyatt Mercer was already in the yard moving toward the barn with a bucket in each hand, his back to her. He was dressed the same as yesterday, same range clothes, same battered hat. He moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done the morning tasks alone for a very long time. He heard her step, stopped, turned. His eyes were red at the rims, shadowed beneath. He looked like a man who had not slept or had slept badly or had spent the hours when he might have slept doing something else entirely. Sleep all right, he said. Well enough, Clara said. They looked at each other in the September morning light. Two strangers, $900 and a signed piece of paper between them. 5 years ahead of them and no clearer picture of what those years would look like when they arrived. Come on, Mercer said and turned back toward the barn. Clara followed. There was work to do. The morning Wyatt Mercer taught Clara Ashford to shoot was the morning she began to understand that survival was not a passive condition. It required practice. He set 6 bottles on the top rail of the corral fence just after breakfast, brown glass catching the early light, and he stood behind her left shoulder and showed her how to hold the revolver with both hands, how to align the front sight with the rear notch, how to breathe out slowly and squeeze rather than pull the difference between the two. Being the difference between hitting what you aim at and hitting whatever happens to be in the general vicinity. The first shot went wide by 4 feet, and the recoil nearly knocked the gun from her hands. The second went wide by 2 feet. The third shattered a bottle. The sound of breaking glass carried across the empty morning, and Clara felt something fierce and unexpected move through her chest, something that had no gentle name, something closer to the feeling of a door being kicked open than anything she had experienced in a long time. Again, Mercer said. She fired until her hands ached and her ears rang with a high, persistent tone that turned the world briefly abstract. When the smoke cleared, 4 of the 6 bottles were gone. The remaining 2 stood intact on the fence rail, catching the light, apparently unimpressed. Mercer studied the results. You're a natural. I had good motivation. He almost responded to that. She could see it in the slight movement at the corner of his mouth. Instead, he collected the gun, reloaded it with the practiced efficiency of a man for whom the mechanics of firearms were as unremarkable as the mechanics of breathing, and handed it back. Every day, he said, until it's the same as reaching for a door handle. They walked back to the yard together. Clara was still feeling the vibration of the recoil in her palms, that particular aliveness of hands that had been used for something that mattered. Mercer walked beside her with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat brim shading his eyes against the angle of the morning sun. She asked the question that had been waiting since yesterday. You said you knew who Thomas Bridger was when you shot him. The walking did not change. The pace did not shift. But something in the air between them shifted the way pressure shifts before weather. Yeah. Then tell me the rest of it. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was deciding whether to answer at all. Then he stopped at the edge of the yard and looked out at the north pasture where the Herefords were grazing in their slow, indifferent way. 3 weeks before the shootout, I got a letter, he said. No signature, no return address, just information. Names, dates, bank transfers going back 18 months. Everything I needed to prove that Thomas Bridger had been feeding the Keller gang their targets, telling them when shipments moved, when guards changed shifts, which banks had minimum protection on which days. Clara waited. 4 people died in that Laramie robbery. A teller named Harmon, who had 3 children. A Pinkerton guard who'd been on the job 11 days. 2 depositors who happened to be in the wrong bank at the wrong hour. Mercer turned away from the pasture. Bridger gave the gang everything they needed to make sure those people died. And then he kept his badge and his salary and went back to work like it never happened. So when you found him in that shootout, I knew. His voice was flat. I'd known for 3 weeks. I'd been building the case quietly, waiting until I had enough to bring charges that would stick. But that day outside Laramie when the shooting started and the smoke cleared and I could see him clearly, he knew I knew. He could see it in my face. A pause. He drew first. I was faster. That's all there is to it, technically. But I found his journal on his body after. Mercer crossed to the barn, pulled open the door. The smell of hay and horses and old leather rolled out into the morning. He'd been carrying it, 40 pages of his own handwriting. Every crime listed, every contact named, every dollar that moved through his hands. He stopped inside the doorway, a confession nobody asked for from a man who was already dead. And you kept it. I kept it because it was the only proof I had that what I did was right, that Thomas Bridger was exactly what I knew him to be. He moved to the back of the barn, knelt at a stall, pried up a loose board. But I can't use it. I took it off a dead man's body without witnesses. Any lawyer worth his fee would argue I created it, planted it after the fact to justify what I did. He pulled out an oilcloth package, held it. 40 pages of the truth, and it's worth nothing in a courtroom. Clara looked at the package. So you've been carrying it for 5 years. Seemed like the right thing to keep. He replaced the board and stood. Seemed like the least I owed him, to know exactly what he was and not let anyone take that away by saying I was wrong. He put the journal back and they went outside into the light, and neither of them said anything for a while because some things need space around them before they can be properly understood. It was mid-morning when they heard the horse. A single rider coming from the direction of town, moving at a deliberate pace, the pace of someone who is not in a hurry because they know that what they are carrying will still be true when they arrive. Mercer saw him first and went very still in the way that trained men go still, not tense, not coiled, just present and watchful. Clara had already picked up the revolver from the porch rail where she'd set it down. The rider was an older man, 60, maybe more. He wore a marshal's badge on his coat, tarnished but visible, and he carried himself with the weary authority of someone who had spent decades watching the consequences of other people's decisions and had formed precise opinions about human nature as a result. He pulled up at the edge of the yard, raised one hand slowly, showing empty palm. Easy, I'm not here for trouble. His eyes moved from Clara to the gun in her hand, then to Mercer. Something passed through his expression. Wyatt. Hollis. Mercer's voice was careful. Long ride from Cheyenne. Longer than I'd like. Marshal Hollis dismounted, walked his horse to the water trough, let it drink. Then he turned and pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. This came through the office 4 days ago. Thought you deserved to know before someone else brought it. Mercer crossed the yard and took the paper. Read it. Clara watched his face. She had been watching his face for 2 days now, and she had learned its vocabulary. She knew the stillness that meant he was processing something difficult. She knew the set of his jaw when he was deciding whether to speak. She watched those things now, and she watched something else move through his features, something quieter and more final, the expression of a man recognizing the arrival of something he has been expecting for a long time. He lowered the paper. How long do I have? Warrants issued out of Denver. Murder in the commission of a felony. James filed the charges himself. Hollis's voice was level, not unkind. Territorial law moves slow. You've got maybe a week before someone comes to serve it formally. And the bounty. $1,000 for information leading to your location. Hollis glanced at Clara. Not dead or alive. James is being specific about that. Because he wants to be the one. Mercer folded the paper. He's been planning this for 5 years. He's not going to let some bounty hunter take the ending. Hollis said nothing to that, which was its own kind of answer. Clara stepped forward. Who is James Bridger? Thomas's younger brother. Mercer set the paper on the porch rail. 17 years old when Thomas died. Grew up with the story of how a crooked marshal shot his brother in cold blood. A pause. Former Confederate sharpshooter. Good with a rifle at distances that make other men uncomfortable. And he's been looking for you for 5 years. He found me twice before. I moved each time. Each. Mercer looked at the yard, at the fence line, at the small mounds of earth at the edge of the trees. I'm tired of moving. Then why didn't he come sooner, Clara said. Mercer was quiet a moment. Money, men, legal standing. James is careful. He waited until he had all three. Waited until he could do this the right way with a warrant behind him that made him look like justice instead of revenge. He looked at Hollis. He filed those charges the day he had enough men to ride with him. Hollis nodded once, confirming it without words. He stayed for an hour. He and Mercer sat on the porch and talked in the low, careful voices of men working through the mechanics of a situation that has no clean solution. Clara listened from the doorway of the main house and heard the shape of it even when she could not hear the specific words. When Hollis rode out, he paused at the edge of the yard and looked back at Clara. You'd be smart to leave, he said. Whatever arrangement you have here, it's going to get complicated fast. Clara looked at him steadily. I've been in complicated arrangements before. Hollis studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man revising his assessment of someone, and rode north toward town and disappeared. The afternoon passed in ordinary work, the feeding and watering and fencing and hauling that constitute the actual substance of ranch life when nobody is threatening to shoot anyone. They worked in the quiet companionship that had begun to develop between them. Not friendship, yet not trust exactly, but something functional and decent, two people who had agreed on a set of terms and were honoring them. At supper, Clara made a better stew than the night before, drawing on the root cellar's last potatoes and a bundle of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Mercer ate 2 bowls without commenting on the improvement, which she decided to interpret as its own form of compliment. They were washing the dishes, Clara washing, and Mercer drying, when she said without turning, "He's going to come." "Yes." "And you're not going to run?" "No." "Then we should be ready." She heard him set a bowl down on the shelf. "Clara." She turned. He was looking at her with the direct, exhausted honesty that seemed to be the mode he defaulted to when he had run out of reasons to be careful. "Whatever happens, when James Bridger shows up, that's my debt, not yours. You don't have to be part of it." "I'm already part of it." She held his gaze. "I signed your contract, remember? That makes your debt my business." He looked like he wanted to argue. She turned back to the dishes, and the argument never came. 3 nights later, at 10:30, the horses arrived. Clara heard them first. She was at the window of the main house where she had taken to spending her evenings, the chairs by the fire more comfortable than anything in the cabin, and Mercer seemed to have made his peace with her presence in a way he expressed through the simple act of not remarking on it. She heard the rhythm of multiple horses moving in deliberate formation, not passing through, coming here. Wyatt, he was already on his feet, already moving to the rifle above the fireplace. He pulled it down with one smooth motion and checked the load with the automatic efficiency of old habit. Then he was at the window beside her, looking out at the dark. 5 riders, moving up the road without attempting to conceal themselves, without lowering their pace. 5 men who had decided before they left that they were not going to pretend this was anything other than what it was. "I'll go out," Mercer said. "I'm coming." "Clara, I'm coming." He looked at her once briefly, then went to the door. She took the rifle from the cabinet where it lived and followed him onto the porch. The riders pulled up in the yard. 5 men, all armed, all looking at the 2 people on the porch with the measuring attention of people who have rehearsed this scene many times and are now in the performance of it. The man in front was younger than Clara had expected. Late 20s. He had the lean, angular quality of someone who had spent years outdoors doing difficult work. Dark eyes, a stillness about him that was not calm so much as it was a long practice of controlled intensity. He looked at Mercer with the absolute focus of someone who has organized years of their life around this specific moment. Then he looked at Clara. "Didn't expect company," he said. "This is my partner." Mercer's voice was steady. "She stays." Partner. James Bridger's mouth moved with something that was not quite a smile. "That's an interesting word for what she is given the circumstances." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Warrants issued, Mercer. Murder in the commission of a felony. Conspiracy. I can serve it tonight, walk you to Cheyenne in the morning. Let the courts decide." Or what?" Clara said. James looked at her. "Or we can settle this the way men settled things before there were courts." "He's not settling anything tonight." She raised the rifle. pointed it at James Bridger's chest with both hands and held it there. And you're not taking him anywhere without a trial. The yard went completely quiet. One of the riders shifted his weight, and his horse moved a step sideways and then went still. James studied her for a long moment. You know what he did? I know what happened, Clara said. That's not the same thing. Mercer stepped forward, not toward his rifle, not toward the riders, toward the barn. One deliberate step, then another. Every eye tracked him. Where do you think you're going? One of the riders said. Getting something. He walked to the barn without hurrying. 30 seconds passed. Clara held the rifle on James Bridger and breathed steadily, and did not allow herself to think about how many guns were in the yard and how many were pointed at how many people and what the arithmetic of that meant. She kept her eyes on James and her hands level and her breathing even. Mercer came back out of the barn carrying the oilcloth package. He unwrapped it as he walked, held up the journal in the lamplight from the house so that it was clearly visible. This is your brother's handwriting, he said. 40 pages. Every crime he committed, every piece of information he sold, every person who died because of it. He walked to within 10 feet of James Bridger and held it out. Read it. James did not move. Read it, Mercer said again. Something shifted in the younger man's face, some calcification of certainty beginning to crack at its edges. He reached down slowly from the saddle and took the journal, opened it, looked at the first page. The yard was silent enough that Clara could hear the pages turning. James read one page, 2. His face changed with each one, not dramatically, not the theatrical collapse of a man whose convictions are being destroyed, but the slow private diminishment of someone watching the story they have believed in for years develop unfamiliar details. The color left his face gradually, the way light leaves the sky so slowly you cannot identify the exact moment it's gone. His hands began to shake. This is forgery, he said. The words had no strength behind them. It's his handwriting, and you know it. Mercer's voice was quiet, almost gentle. The gentleness was not soft. It was the gentleness of someone delivering truth that cannot be softened, who has chosen to deliver it carefully anyway, out of some residual respect for the person receiving it. I'm sorry, James. I know what it is to lose family. But your brother made his choices, and those choices killed 4 people before I stopped him. James read another page, and another. One of his men leaned from his saddle and looked over James's shoulder. Clara watched his face change. He straightened up slowly and looked at the back of James Bridger's head, and then at Mercer, and then at the ground with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. He does not want to come out the way it is coming out. Boss, the man said carefully, if this is real, I don't know yet if it's real. The dates match, the names match, the amounts. I said I don't know yet. But his hands were still shaking. Clara could see them from where she stood, the trembling of a man whose certainty has been structurally compromised and who is only now beginning to feel the full weight of what he has built on top of it. James closed the journal. He held it against his chest with both hands. Held it the way you hold something you have just been given that you cannot yet decide whether you want. He looked at Mercer for a long time. He looked at Clara. He looked at the rifle still leveled at his chest. You'd have shot me, he said. Yes. Why, he's not your blood. You've known him 3 days. Clara held his gaze. Because 3 days ago I was property. He made me a partner. That's worth defending. James's mouth tightened. Something moved through his eyes that was more complicated than hatred and less simple than grief. He tucked the journal inside his coat. I'm taking this to be verified, he said. 3 handwriting experts. Independent. If it comes back as authentic. He stopped, swallowed. If it comes back authentic, then I've been hunting the wrong man for 5 years. A pause. I won't be the first person to do that. He looked at Mercer one more time, long and measuring and carrying the quality of a man saying something with his eyes that he cannot bring himself to say with his mouth. Then he turned his horse and rode out of the yard, and his men followed, and the sound of the hooves faded into the dark prairie, and the silence that came back was different from the silence before they had arrived. Deeper, more complicated. Clara lowered the rifle. Her arms were shaking. She had not noticed them shaking until the moment she no longer needed to hold them steady. Mercer crossed the yard to her, stood close, and looked at her face in the lamplight from the house. He did not touch her. He just looked, checking for damage the way you check something after a near miss, making sure the thing is still intact. You all right? Ask me again in an hour. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. He'll come back. Maybe, if the journal's authentic, he comes back differently. And if it's not, Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then I face whatever comes. Clara looked at him, at the steadiness of him, at the way he had handed his only evidence to a man who might have destroyed it, because the alternative was to deny someone else the truth he had been denied for 5 years. She did not know what to do with a man like that. She went to bed and lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the prairie and thinking. The east fence was burning when she woke. She smelled it before she saw it, that specific smell of burning wood that is not a cook fire, that has urgency in it, that makes the body respond before the mind has finished processing. She was outside with the revolver before she was fully conscious. The sun had just cleared the horizon. The light was flat and gold and showed her everything clearly. 3 separate sections of the east fence were burning, each a good 30 feet apart, each burning steadily, as though the fires had been started simultaneously by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Mercer was already running with buckets. They worked without speaking for an hour, hauling water from the well, throwing it on flames that seemed to know they had time. The heat was intense and personal, the kind that gets inside your clothes and your lungs and your hair. Clara's hands blistered on the bucket handles. She did not stop. When the last section was out, they stood in the ash and looked at what remained. 20 yards of fence. Gone. Posts reduced to black stumps. Wire melted into useless shapes. 3 fires. Started at the same time. Not an accident. Eleanor, Clara said. Most likely. Mercer kicked at a charred post. It disintegrated. This is what a warning looks like when lawyers aren't enough. And they rode to town in the mid-mornings wearing the smell of smoke and the expression of people who have run out of patience for procedural courtesy. The town council met in a room above the general store, 6 men arranged behind a long table, with the self-conscious authority of people who hold local power and are acutely aware that local power has precise limits. Eleanor Pettigrew was already there. She stood to the side of the room in her purple dress, composed and prepared, with a leather bag on the table in front of her, and the expression of someone who has been looking forward to this particular morning for a considerable time. The council chairman, a heavy man named Hutchins, who owned the grain warehouse and had the grain warehouse owner's habit of calculating the value of everything before deciding how to treat it, cleared his throat. We've received a petition regarding irregularities in a recent land transfer, he said. Claims have been made that certain agreements signed under conditions of indenture are invalid and that the rights to said property get to the water, Eleanor said. Hutchins looked at her. She looked back with the patience of someone who has already won and is simply waiting for the formalities to acknowledge it. The core of Mrs. Pettigrew's claim, Hutchins said carefully, involves water rights, specifically rights to the aquifer that feeds the Mercer Ranch. Clara went very still. She looked at Eleanor, at the leather bag on the table, at the carefully arranged composure of a woman who had not dressed this well and prepared this thoroughly for a simple property dispute. What aquifer? Mercer said. The one under your south pasture. Eleanor opened her bag with the unhurried movement of someone playing the final hand of a game they have already won. The one that feeds not only your property, but 3 others downstream through underground channels. She placed a document on the table. 2 years ago, my late husband extended a loan to Hiram Cadell. The loan was secured against all assets in Cadell's possession or under his control, including a claim on water rights to the Mercer Ranch aquifer, which Cadell held by prior agreement with the previous owner. Hutchins took the document. Read it. His face became carefully neutral in the way that faces become neutral when they are working very hard not to show what they are thinking. Clara looked at the document from across the room. Then she looked at Eleanor, and she understood. Not the legal language, not the specific mechanism of the claim, but the architecture of it, the shape of what this woman had been building. Because this was not about Clara's contract, or Wyatt's guilt, or the burned fence, or any of the things that had appeared to be the issue for the past week. This was about water, water that fed half the valley, water that could not be replaced or redirected or found somewhere else, because this was Wyoming territory in September and the rains would not come until spring, and 4 properties depended on what ran silently through the rock beneath Mercer's south pasture. Control the water, and you controlled everything that depended on it. The ranches, the families, the livelihoods, all of it. You planned this from before Cadell died, Clara said. Eleanor turned to look at her with the mild interest of someone noting an observation that is correct but not particularly surprising. I plan everything, Miss Ashford. The loan, the contract, buying Cadell's debt, all of it was to get access to the water rights. The loan was a legitimate business transaction. Eleanor's voice was pleasant and absolutely empty of any quality that resembled warmth. What happens to the assets that secure it is simply the natural consequence of the law operating as intended. Mercer's jaw had gone tight. Cadell never had any claim to water rights on my land. His prior agreement with the previous owner suggests otherwise. Eleanor smiled. You're welcome to challenge it in court. That process takes approximately 18 months. In the meantime, I'll be pursuing emergency injunctive relief to freeze any transfers or improvements on the affected properties. She looked at Hutchins. I believe we're finished here. She gathered her papers. Clara watched her move toward the door, watched the council members exchange glances of men who have been outmaneuvered by someone smarter than they are, and watched the whole careful machinery of Eleanor's plan continue its operation with the smooth indifference of something built to run regardless of what anyone thought about it. Eleanor paused at the door. You have until noon tomorrow to sign over the water rights voluntarily, she said. After that, the legal process becomes considerably less comfortable for everyone involved. She looked at Clara with something that might in a generous interpretation have been pity. You should choose your partnerships more carefully, Miss Ashford. She left. Mercer rode to Cheyenne the following morning at first light. He had sent a telegram the night before to a lawyer named Catherine Marsh, who knew water law and property rights, and who, as Mercer explained it in the careful language of a man discussing a debt that has multiple currencies, owed him a specific kind of favor that he had never collected. Clara stood in the yard and watched him disappear over the north rise. Then she fed the chickens and checked the cattle and walked the full perimeter of the property looking for signs of tampering. She found 3 places along the south fence where the wire had been loosened. She tightened it herself with pliers from the barn, working slowly in the morning heat, doing the job properly. By noon, the sun was brutal. She was on the porch with water and the revolver when the wagon came from town. A single wagon, one driver young, working for the general store by the look of him. He pulled up in the yard with the self-conscious nervousness of someone who has been told to do something he finds uncomfortable and is doing it anyway because he needs the work. Delivery from Mercer Ranch, he said. Paid in full this morning. He unloaded while Clara watched. Flour, coffee, salt pork, beans, sugar. A month's provisions stacked on the porch with the efficiency of someone who wants to be finished and gone. He left fast. Clara looked at the supplies. Anonymous payment, no signature on the note he'd handed her, neat and complete and utterly unrequested. She checked the flour first. She opened the sack and ran her hand through it, and her fingers found something that flour does not contain. She dug deeper. Stone. Smooth river stones distributed evenly through the flour to give the bag its proper weight. The flour itself present only in the top 3 inches. She checked the coffee. Rocks again wrapped in burlap to approximate the feel of beans. The salt pork unwrapped rancid the freshness of the paper concealing what was inside. The beans she poured into her palm and looked at for a moment before she saw them moving. She threw everything into the yard. All of it, every tin, every piece of the delivery that had arrived without a name. She threw it with the controlled fury of someone who has used up their patience for being handled, and then she stood in the yard breathing hard, looking at the scattered ruin of a message she was meant to understand. Eleanor could reach her anywhere, could get to her provisions, her supplies, her daily life, could contaminate what she consumed, and there would be no proof and no recourse, and no way to be certain that the next delivery or the next purchase at the general store was not similarly arranged. This was what it felt like to be hunted by money rather than by guns. Clara went to the barn, found tools, spent the afternoon nailing boards across the windows of both buildings, reinforcing door frames, creating the kind of obstacles that would not stop determined men but would slow them, would make noise, would give her time to reach the revolver and put herself somewhere defensible. She worked until her back ached and the sun was going down. She was eating the last of yesterday's bread on the porch, watching the dark come in from the east when she heard them. Not one rider this time, multiple, and moving fast without the deliberate pace of men who expect to be challenged. The pace of men who have been told there is nobody here who can stop them. Clara counted the sound of the hoofbeats, more than 5. She went inside, took the revolver and the extra rounds from the cabinet, loaded everything she could carry, and came back to the porch. The moon was 3/4 full and bright enough to see the yard clearly and see the road and see the moment when the riders appeared, 8 of them spreading out as they came through the gate, the way men spread out when they have practiced this particular movement. The leader had a scarred face. He had been here before that afternoon when he had delivered Eleanor's verbal message. He looked at Clara on the porch with the mild professional interest of someone whose work tonight is simply the continuation of work begun earlier in the day. "Last chance," he said. "Sign the water rights to Mrs. Pettigrew and we leave peaceable. Get off this property. 6 shots in that revolver, 8 of us." He sounded almost apologetic about the arithmetic. "You're smart enough to see how this ends." Clara raised the revolver. She had 4 of the 6 targets positioned in her mind before the first shot fired the same way Mercer had taught her sightline to target. Oh, exhale, squeeze. The first man went down. She moved to the second before the first had finished falling. The second shot hit. She fired again and missed, adjusted, fired again. 4 shots. 2 men down. The remaining 6 reached the porch. She swung the revolver like a club and felt it connect with bone and heard someone curse, and then the numbers were simply too large, and she was down the boards of the porch, hard against her face, her arms pinned. Her last shot unfired the revolver somewhere beyond her reach. The scarred man picked it up. He stood over her, and she looked up at him and breathed and did not look away, because she would not give him the satisfaction of looking away, and he looked down at her with something that might have been professional respect if it had been attached to any kind of conscience. He raised the revolver. A shot came from outside the yard, not the revolver in his hand, from somewhere else, from the darkness beyond the fence line, from the direction of the north road, precise and deliberate, the shot of someone who has had a long time to find the right angle. The scarred man stumbled, looked at his shoulder, looked up. Then the men were running, all of them mounting and wheeling and scattering into the dark with the haste of people who have just recalculated the situation and found the new numbers unacceptable. The thunder of hooves faded. The yard went still. Clara pushed herself upright, got her hands under her, got her feet under her. She was standing more or less when Wyatt Mercer came through the gate at a run with a rifle in his hands and fear on his face that was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. Behind him, mounted and unhurried, came a woman, tall, riding clothes, a second rifle resting across her saddle with the ease of someone who has carried rifles for a long time. She had the face of a person who processes situations quickly and expresses the results of that processing in immediate action, and she was currently processing the scene in the yard with the systematic attention of someone making a list. Mercer reached Clara. His hands went to her arms, checking. "I'm all right," Clara said. "How did you saw your barricades from the road?" His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the ride. Knew something was wrong. He looked at the 2 men down in the yard, at the scattered evidence of the fight. "How many?" 8, 2 down, 6 ran. She steadied herself. Her legs wanted to shake, and she would not let them. "You weren't supposed to be back until tomorrow." "Change my plans." He looked at her face for another moment, with that unguarded fear still visible, and then he controlled it, and it was gone, and he turned to the woman who had dismounted and was walking toward them. "Miss Ashford," the woman said, "I'm Catherine Marsh. I've been watching Eleanor Pettigrew's activities in this territory for several weeks." She looked at the yard with precise, unhurried attention. "It appears I arrived at the correct moment." "She's good at that," Mercer said. "I'm expensive at it." Catherine looked at Clara. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then let's go inside. I need to know everything that happened since you arrived in Millerton, and I need to know it in sequence, and I need you to leave nothing out." She moved toward the house with the focused efficiency of someone for whom time is a finite resource to be allocated carefully. "Because what I've seen tonight isn't vandalism or intimidation. It's attempted murder. And that changes what we can do to Eleanor Pettigrew considerably." Clara looked at Wyatt. He looked back at her with those pale eyes and the thing in them that she was learning to read, not guilt. Tonight, not the old familiar weight of it, but something present and alert and quietly furious on her behalf. Partners, she said. Partners. He held the door. She walked inside. The lamp was lit and the fire was low, and outside the prairie was dark, and the two men who had come to frighten her out of a home she had owned for 5 days were lying in the yard, and somewhere to the north, Eleanor Pettigrew was sitting in a house she intended to keep and planning her next move, and none of that was finished yet. But Clara Ashford was alive. She sat down at the table and began to talk. Catherine Marsh took notes the way a surgeon operates. Clean, precise, without sentiment, with the focused economy of someone who understands that everything unnecessary is a liability. She sat across the table from Clara with a pen and a leather-bound notebook, and she listened to 3 hours of testimony without interrupting, except to ask specific questions about specific details. Dates, times, the exact wording of threats, the number of riders and the direction from which they had come, the content of the council meeting, and the precise language Eleanor had used when presenting her water rights claim. When Clara finished, Catherine set down her pen and looked at her notes and was quiet for a moment. Mercer poured coffee. It was terrible as always. Nobody commented. "The water rights document is fraudulent," Catherine said. She said it the way you say something you have already decided is true, calmly, without the inflection of a theory being proposed. "How do you know?" Mercer said. "Because 2 years ago, when Eleanor claims her husband made this loan to Cadell, I was handling a property dispute in this county that involved the land registry. I reviewed every water rights filing in the territorial record going back to 1875. She looked up. There was no water rights claim attached to the Mercer property. Not by Cadell, not by the previous owner, not by anyone. She closed the notebook. Eleanor created that document after Cadell died. She needed something that would hold up long enough to intimidate you into signing voluntarily, because a forced transaction leaves witnesses and a paper trail. "Can you prove it?" Clara said. "I can prove the ink is wrong." Catherine picked up her coffee, looked at it, set it down without drinking. Standard legal ink available in Wyoming Territory in 1881 has a specific chemical composition. It oxidizes differently than ink manufactured after 1882. A formulation change came through in late 82 when the main supplier out of St. Louis updated their process. She looked at them both. The water rights clause in Eleanor's document was written with the newer ink. I'd stake my license on it. Outside, the prairie was fully dark and quiet. The two men who had been carried to the barn were no longer in the yard. The territorial marshal had been sent for. Clara's hands had stopped shaking sometime in the second hour of testimony, when the act of speaking clearly about what had happened had replaced the act of surviving it. "There's more," Catherine said. "I've been building a case against Eleanor for 3 months. She's done this before. A widow named Hargrove in Laramie lost her property to a similar water rights claim 14 months ago. A rancher named Dell outside Casper the year before that. Each time fraudulent documentation. Each time pushed through local councils before anyone could properly review the legal standing, each time ending in a voluntary transfer because the victims couldn't afford a 2-year legal fight." Mercer leaned back in his chair. "She's been building a water empire." "She has been building a water empire," Catherine agreed. "And you are the largest remaining piece. Control the Mercer aquifer, and she controls the water supply for this entire section of the valley." She looked at her notes. "She won't stop. Whatever happened tonight is not the end of it. The men she sent were a test to see if you'd break before the courts got involved. You didn't break." "No," Clara said, "and she'll escalate." Catherine closed her leather bag. "Which is why we need to move first. Tomorrow morning I'll file for an emergency injunction preventing Eleanor from taking any legal action against this property while the fraud investigation is ongoing. At the same time, I'll file a formal complaint with the Territorial Marshal's office documenting tonight's attack." She paused. "The dead man in your barn is the most useful piece of evidence you have. He's traceable to Eleanor through the payment she made to hire these men. Arrogant people pay by check." She stood. "Get some sleep," she said. "Both of you. Tomorrow is going to be a long day and you need to be present for it." She went to the small cabin that had been prepared for her, and the door closed and the lamp in the window went on. Clara and Mercer sat alone at the table in the quiet of the main house and listened to the fire settle. "She's extraordinary," Clara said. "She's terrifying," Mercer said. "There's a difference, Rayo." Clara almost smiled. It felt strange on her face, like a muscle that had been unused for a long time and had forgotten its range of motion. "Go to bed," Mercer said. He was already collecting the cups. "You held off 8 men tonight. That deserves more than 3 hours of sleep." Clara stood. She was at the door when she stopped. "Wyatt," he looked up from the basin. "You came back early." A pause. "I said I'd be back." "You said tomorrow night." He looked at her steadily. The lamp made his face look older, deeper, the lines around his eyes more pronounced. "I pushed hard." Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she went to her cabin and locked the door and lay down fully dressed and was asleep before she had finished the thought she was trying to complete. 3 weeks passed. They were not quiet weeks. The territorial marshal came and took statements and went. Catherine filed injunctions and counterfilings and documents with names Clara could not fully parse, moving through the legal system with the patient, relentless efficiency of water finding its way through rock. Mercer repaired the burned fence. Clara planted the remainder of the winter garden and found that she had a talent for it, or perhaps simply a determination which in her experience amounted to approximately the same thing. Eleanor Pettigrew made no further moves against the property. The injunction had put a legal wall between her actions and their consequences, and Eleanor was many things, but she was not foolish. She waited. Clara felt the waiting the way you feel weather coming before it arrives, a pressure in the atmosphere, something building behind the stillness. The morning the trial was set to begin, Clara woke before the roosters. She dressed in her better dress, the one without the stain on the left cuff, and braided her hair with the care of someone who understands that presentation is a form of argument. She was on the porch with coffee when Mercer came out of the main house in his one good shirt, the one without patches at the elbows, and they looked at each other in the early light. "Ready," Clara said. "No," Mercer said. "Let's go anyway." The Millerton Courthouse was a single room above the land registry office with 4 rows of wooden benches and a judge's table at the front, and windows that looked out over the main street and let in the October light. Every seat was filled before 9 in the morning. People stood along the walls. Clara had not understood until she walked in and felt the density of the attention in the room, how much this trial meant to the town. Eleanor Pettigrew had been collecting property for years. Everyone in that room knew someone who had lost something to her, or knew someone who had been afraid of losing something to her, or was currently afraid. The crowd had the quality of people who have been waiting for permission to stop being afraid and are not yet sure that permission has arrived. Eleanor sat at the defendant's table with her spine straight and her hands folded and her face arranged into an expression of composed dignity that Clara recognized as the face Eleanor wore when she was working hardest at controlling what was visible. Her lawyer, the nervous young man from Denver, who had been brought in because the local lawyers all had complicated histories with Eleanor's methods, sat beside her, shuffling papers, with the focused energy of someone who has taken a case he is beginning to regret. Judge Thornton had come from Cheyenne. He was an old man, older than he looked until you looked closely, the kind of old that has been arrived at through the application of continuous thought over a long period of time. He had a way of sitting that suggested the bench was not particularly comfortable, and he was not particularly bothered by telling you that. He had reviewed the documents the night before. Catherine had made sure he reviewed them. He looked at the room, once the long, patient look of a man assessing the temperature of a space before deciding how to manage it. Then he looked at his papers. "We're here on the matter of fraudulent land appropriation," he said without preamble. "Specifically the question of whether a water rights claim filed by Eleanor Pettigrew is a legitimate legal instrument or a document manufactured after the fact to support an unlawful taking." He looked at Catherine. "Counselor." Catherine stood. She had dressed simply. Dark coat, plain collar, no ornamentation of any kind. She had explained to Clara the night before that in a frontier courthouse, before a judge who had been riding circuit for 30 years, the visual argument was simplicity versus pretension, and simplicity won. She placed 2 documents on the judge's table. Set them side by side. Step back. "Your Honor, these are the 2 documents at the center of this matter. The first is the original loan agreement between the late Harold Pettigrew and Hiram Cadell dated March of 1881. The second is the water rights addendum filed by Eleanor Pettigrew with the county land office 4 days after Cadell's death. Judge Thornton looked at them without touching them. The handwriting in the water rights clause, Catherine said, is consistent with Eleanor Pettigrew's own hand. The county clerk who processed the filing has confirmed this under oath. She picked up a folder. Additionally, we have the report of Professor William Alcott of the University of Wyoming Department of Chemistry, who analyzed the ink composition of both documents. She opened the folder, read from it without flourish. The original loan agreement was written in standard territorial legal ink batch formulation, 1879, which oxidizes to a brownish gray at a specific measurable rate over time. The water rights clause was written in a newer formulation, first manufactured in late 1882, which oxidizes differently and retains a slightly bluer tone. The ink in the water rights clause, she looked up, is chemically impossible to have been written in 1881. It did not exist in 1881. The room made a sound, not loud, not dramatic, the sound of a large number of people processing information that confirms what they had suspected, but had not been able to prove the sound of a collective shift in the architecture of certainty. Eleanor's lawyer stood. Your Honor, with respect, chemical analysis of ink is hardly a definitive. Sit down, Judge Thornton said, not unkindly, simply as a statement of what was going to happen. The lawyer sat down. Catherine continued. She was thorough. She had the patience of someone who understands that the work of destroying a false structure must be done completely, that leaving one beam standing allows the whole thing to be rebuilt. She presented the testimony of the Territorial Land Office Registrar, who confirmed that no water rights claim had been filed against the Mercer property during Cadell's lifetime. She presented the bank records that traced the payment made to the men who had attacked the ranch, a payment drawn from an account held in Eleanor Pettigrew's name at the Millerton First Bank. She presented the testimony of 6 of those men who had accepted reduced sentences in exchange for providing it. She presented evidence of the Hargrove property in Laramie, the Dell Ranch outside Casper, 2 other properties that had not been part of the original case but had emerged during Catherine's 3 weeks of preparation, each with the same fingerprints, the same methods, the same careful construction of fraudulent documentation. Eleanor's lawyer made objections. Judge Thornton overruled them with the quiet efficiency of someone who has heard the same objections many times and found them unpersuasive on each occasion. Eleanor herself sat motionless through all of it. Clara watched her. She had expected something to break in Eleanor's composure, had expected the accumulation of evidence to find some crack in the surface of the woman's self-possession. But Eleanor sat as she had sat at the beginning, spine straight, hands folded, face arranged, the only visible evidence of internal disturbance, the slight whitening of her knuckles against the dark wood of the table. It was when Catherine placed the Hargrove testimony on the judge's table that something finally changed. Eleanor's eyes moved to Clara. Just for a moment, a single unguarded moment of looking, and what was in that look was not the calculation Clara had seen on the station platform 3 weeks ago, not the contemptuous assessment of a woman pricing livestock. It was something older and less comfortable. It was the look of a person who has spent years being certain about the nature of the world and is currently watching that certainty disassemble itself one piece at a time. Clara held the look. She did not look away. Judge Thornton removed his spectacles and set them on the table and looked at Eleanor Pettigrew for a long moment. Mrs. Pettigrew, he said, the evidence presented today establishes with sufficient certainty that the water rights document you filed is fraudulent, that you manufactured it after the death of Hiram Cadell with the intent to defraud the owners of the Mercer Ranch property. A pause. It further establishes that you hired men to intimidate, threaten, and ultimately attempt to murder Claire Ashford on the night of the 15th in furtherance of this fraudulent claim. Eleanor's lawyer had stopped shuffling papers. You are hereby found guilty of fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and attempted theft of property. The gavel came down once, a clean, precise sound. You will surrender all claims to water rights on the Mercer property effective immediately. You will pay restitution to the property owners in the amount of $5,000 for damages and emotional suffering, and you will serve no less than 10 years in the territorial prison at Rawlins. The room exhaled. The marshal moved to Eleanor's table. She stood before he reached her, stood without being asked, with the automatic dignity of someone for whom being asked to do something is a concession to another person's authority that she will not make even now. She allowed the handcuffs because she had no practical alternative. She did not look at Mercer as she was let out. She looked at Clara. One more time. At the door of the courtroom before the marshal moved her through it, Eleanor Pettigrew looked back across the room at Clara Ashford with an expression that was not quite hatred and not quite defeat, and was instead something more complicated than either. The expression of a woman who has built an entire architecture of understanding about how the world works and who has power in it and why, and who is looking at the person who has demonstrated that the architecture was wrong. Clara looked back steadily. Then Eleanor was gone. The room began to move. The sound of conversation rising, the scrape of benches, the social energy of a crowd that has witnessed something they will be discussing for years. Catherine appeared at Clara's elbow, already putting papers into her bag with the calm efficiency of someone checking tasks off a list. "Well," Catherine said. "Well," Clara said. Mercer stood on Clara's other side. He had not spoken during the trial. He had sat beside her on the front bench with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes forward, and his presence beside her solid and constant in a way she had stopped being able to take for granted sometime in the second week. "Let's go home," he said. They walked out of the courthouse into October light. The season had turned while they had been occupied with Eleanor. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold, and the grass had gone brown, and the sky had achieved the depth of blue that only comes in autumn at altitude, a blue so clean and absolute that looking at it felt like looking at something that had been there before people and would be there long after. Catherine met them on the courthouse steps. She was already in her riding coat, already pulling on her gloves, already oriented toward the next thing, with the momentum of someone for whom completion is simply the transition point between tasks. "I told you I'd bury her," she said. "You did," Clara said. "Thank you." Catherine looked at her with something that was not quite warmth, but was its close professional cousin. "Eleanor destroyed 4 families before yours. Because of you, she won't destroy anyone else." She picked up her bag. "That's worth the ride from Cheyenne." She turned to Mercer. "We're even," she said. "The information about Sullivan. I'll have the case open by the end of the month." Mercer nodded. "But if you ever need a good lawyer again," Catherine said, and there was something in her voice now, something that might have been the beginning of humor if she had allowed it to fully develop. "You know where to find me." She mounted her haramband and rode north without looking back, already gone, in the way that people who live at high velocity are gone before they have technically left. Clara watched her disappear around the first bend in the road. "Terrifying," she said. "Extraordinary," Mercer said. "There's a difference between—" She looked at him. He was looking at the road. But there was something at the corner of his mouth, the thing she had been watching develop for 3 weeks, the almost smile that appeared more frequently now and stayed longer than it had in the beginning. She had started to understand that this was the form his particular version of happiness took. Not the wide, unguarded smile from the photograph on the mantel. That smile belonged to a different Wyatt Mercer, a younger one, a man who had not yet learned the things this man had learned. This was what remained of it, refined and quieter, and perhaps more honest for having been reduced to its essentials. They drove the wagon home. The prairie moved around them in the October wind, the grass rippling in long waves, the cottonwoods along the creek line throwing gold light up into the blue sky. Clara watched it go past and felt something happening in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, something that required no name but was warm and specific and entirely her own. They were almost to the ranch when Mercer said, "He came yesterday." Clara turned to look at him. "James Bridger, while you were in town with Catherine going over final preparations." He kept his eyes on the road. The dun horse's ears moved in the wind. He brought the journal back. Clara was quiet. 3 handwriting experts, all independent, all confirmed the same thing. Mercer paused. "Thomas's journal is authentic." The ranch appeared over the rise. The repaired fence line, the barn with its straightened roof, the main house with its clean windows. The cabin with its east-facing window, its cracked glass still intact, still letting in the morning light. "What did James say?" Clara asked. "That he spent 5 years hunting the wrong man." Mercer pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard, set the brake, did not get down immediately. He brought the journal back because he said it belongs here, with me. A pause, Mom. He also brought a letter. He reached inside his coat. The envelope was plain. No marking on the outside except a name written in handwriting Clara had never seen before. The handwriting was hurried, cramped, the script of someone writing quickly under pressure, in conditions that did not allow for careful penmanship. Wyatt Mercer. From Thomas, Mercer said. James found it in a box of old papers. Said Thomas must have written it before the shootout when he knew I was getting close. He held the envelope without opening it. James said I should read it. Said it might help, or it might not, but I should decide for myself. He turned it over in his hands. Clara watched him. Watch the careful way he held the envelope, the way you hold something whose nature you have not yet determined that might break or might burn. Have you read it? She asked. Not yet. He looked at the 3 small mounds of earth at the edge of the cottonwoods. I wasn't sure I was ready. Clara climbed down from the wagon. She walked to the fence and stood with her back to him for a moment, giving him whatever space the distance between them could provide, looking at the grass moving in the wind and the gold of the cottonwoods in the clean line where the land met the sky. Behind her, she heard paper tearing, the quiet sound of an envelope being opened. She did not turn. She listened to the wind and the cattle in the far pasture and the distant call of something high overhead, a hawk working the thermals above the valley. She waited. After a long time, Mercer said her name. She turned. He was sitting on the wagon seat with the letter open in his hands. He was not crying yet. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something very large and very deep, having just understood for the first time how large and how deep it actually is. His voice, when it came, was stripped of everything except the fact of what he was saying. He knew I was coming, Mercer said. He'd known for weeks. He could see the investigation closing in. He knew what the journal would prove once I found it. A pause. He says he drew on me first on purpose, that when he saw my face that day, saw that I knew he understood it was over, that he couldn't face what came after. Mercer looked down at the pages. He says he wanted me to pull the trigger. He says he was tired of what he had become and couldn't find another way out. A pause. And he's sorry for the people who died because of what he did, for making me carry it, for leaving me with it. He stopped. Clara crossed the yard and sat beside him on the wagon seat. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that would improve on the silence, and she had learned in 3 weeks of living next to this man's grief that silence offered honestly is more useful than words offered reflexively. Mercer read the last lines to himself. She could see his eyes moving across the page. She watched his face change the way a landscape changes when light moves across it slowly without dramatic inflection, the same features in different light becoming a different scene. Then he folded the letter, held it with both hands, and he cried. Not the contained, private sobbing she had heard on the first night, the grief carefully managed even in its expression. This was different. This was quieter and deeper, and came from somewhere that the previous crying had not reached, the place where a person keeps the specific weight of a specific guilt they have been carrying so long that it has become structural, load-bearing part of the architecture of who they are. The release of it was not dramatic. It was just tears running steadily down a weathered face in the October light, and a man letting them run without stopping them, which was its own form of courage. Clara put her hand on his arm. She left it there. He did not move away. After a while, the tears stopped in the gradual way that rivers stop tapering to nothing without a clear moment of cessation. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, looked out at the yard, at the fence, at the 3 small mounds of earth. I've been carrying that for 5 years, he said. I know. It doesn't fix anything. Knowing he chose it. A pause. But it's different. It's a different thing to carry. Clara looked at the mounds of earth. A lighter thing. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah. Another pause. Yeah, it is. They sat in the wagon in the October afternoon for a while longer. The horse dozed in the traces. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the barn, a door swung on its hinge with a slow rhythmic sound. Then Mercer climbed down. He went to the barn and came back with a burlap bundle. Small, carried with the care you give to something fragile. He crossed to the east wall of the main house to the corner, where the morning sun arrived first, where the soil was worked loose by the wind and warmer than the surrounding ground. He set the bundle down and knelt, began to dig with his hands. Clara knelt beside him without being asked. They dug together, hollowing out a space in the earth, and then Mercer unwrapped the burlap. Inside was a cutting from a rosebush, small and stripped of leaves and dry-looking, but alive, the specific, stubborn aliveness of dormant things that are waiting for the right conditions. Anna always wanted one, he said every home should have something beautiful growing by the door. He set the cutting carefully into the space they had made. I kept meaning to plant one, always thought there'd be time later. He began packing the earth back around the roots. His hands worked gently, more gently than Clara had seen them move before, with the deliberate care of someone performing an act that is also a statement. There's never more time, Clara said. There's only now. No, he looked up at her. There isn't. They packed the earth together. Mercer fetched water from the well and poured it slowly around the base of the cutting until the ground was dark and rich and the small bare stems stood up in it with the unpretentious optimism of something that intends to grow. Think it'll take, Claire asked. It'll take. He sat back on his heels. This is good ground. Things grow here if you give them what they need. They were still kneeling in the dirt when Mercer reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded paper. He held it out to her without ceremony, without explanation, with the directness of a man who has decided to say a thing and is saying it. Clara took it, unfolded it, read. It was not the original contract, not an amendment or an adjustment of existing terms. It was something new written in his careful, deliberate hand, and what it said in language simpler and more precise than any legal document she had seen was this: equal ownership, half of everything. The land, the cattle, the buildings, the water rights now affirmed and secured by the court's ruling. Equal say in all decisions pertaining to the operation and future of the ranch. No term limit, no conditions of completion, not a contract of service with a defined endpoint, but an agreement of partnership with no predetermined conclusion. At the bottom, in different ink added after the rest, the same way the first contract had its final clause added after deliberation. If you'll have me, not as employer, not as the man who bought your contract, but as your partner in building something worth keeping. Clara read it twice, looked up at him. He was watching her with those pale eyes that she had learned to read over 3 weeks, and what was in them now was not guilt, was not the bone-deep weariness of a man carrying the weight of dead people, was not the resigned patience of someone waiting for the punishment they believe is coming. It was something simpler and more fragile and considerably more difficult to maintain than any of those things. Hope. Yes, Clara said. She said it simply because it was the simple truth, and the simple truth was what this moment required. Something in his face moved. The almost smile arrived, and this time it stayed developed, became an actual smile. And for a moment she could see in it the younger man from the photograph, the man who had stood with his arm around his wife and his hand on his son's shoulder, and looked at the camera like the world was a place that made sense to him. He offered his hand, his working man's hand, calloused and rope-scarred and honest. Clara took it. His grip was warm and firm, and he held it a moment longer than a handshake requires, and then they stood up together out of the dirt beside the newly planted rose cutting in the October afternoon. That evening they ate supper in the main house, a proper meal that Clara had made from provisions that had not been tampered with, from a pantry that was full and legitimately so. The stove worked, the fire in the hearth worked, the windows were clean, the floor had been swept, the photographs on the mantel had been dusted carefully, Anna's kind eyes and Michael's gap-toothed grin visible clearly in the lamplight. After supper, Mercer washed the dishes and Clara dried them. I've been thinking about the barn roof, Mercer said. It needs to come down and go back up properly. I know, before the snow. We have time if we start this week. We'd need help, can't do it with 2 people. There are men in town who need work. We have the restitution money now. Clara set a bowl on the shelf. We could fix the barn roof and the north corral fence and have enough left to get through winter with the cattle in decent condition. That's what I was thinking. They finished the dishes. The fire burned low. Outside, the wind had come up, the first suggestion of the cold that was gathering in the north, the seasonal announcement that summer was fully finished and the country was preparing for its harder months. I was thinking about the cabin, Clara said. He was banking the fire for the night. He did not turn. What about it? It's small and cold in the morning before the stove gets going. She stacked the cups on the shelf. This house is large enough for 2 people to live in without inconveniencing each other. He was quiet. Separate rooms, she said. Proper, but the same house. A pause. It would be more practical. Mercer straightened up from the fireplace. He turned. In the low lamplight, his face had that quality it sometimes had in the evenings, open and undefended in a way that the daylight hours did not always allow for. Practical, he said. Practical. He looked at her for a moment with the attention of someone deciding whether to say the true thing or the safe thing. There's a room at the end of the hall, he said. Faces east. Good light in the morning. Hasn't been used since. He stopped, started again. It would need to be cleaned out, but it's a good room. I know how to clean a room, Clara said. I know you do. They stood in the kitchen with the low fire behind him and the lamp between them in 3 weeks of shared danger and shared labor and the accumulated specific weight of two people who have come to depend on each other in ways neither of them fully intended when the arrangement began. All right, he said. All right, she said. She said good night and went up the stairs for the first time down the hall, past the photographs and the closed doors that held the history of this house to the room at the end that faced east. She opened the door. The room was dusty and still and smelled of disuse, but it was solid and square, and the window was intact, and in the morning the first light would come through it and find her there. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Through the window she could see the yard and the fence and the cottonwoods going dark in the October night, and at the edge of the trees the 3 small mounds of earth with their wooden markers, and beside the east wall of the house barely visible in the darkness, the newly planted rose cutting standing up in its dark ground. Behind her downstairs she heard Mercer moving through the house, the sound of the lamp being turned down, the creak of the stairs, the sequence of sounds that constitutes a person settling in for the night in a house they know well. Tonight there was no crying, just footsteps even, and unhurried moving down the hall, pausing outside her door for a moment, then continuing on. His door closed quietly. The house went still. Clara stood at the window of the east room and looked out at the dark Wyoming prairie and at the small planted thing at the base of the wall below her and at the 3 graves at the edge of the trees, and she thought about Thomas Bridger, who had written a confession and carried it on his body like a penance and finally found his ending, and Anna Mercer, who had laughed through labor and seen the best in everyone and died while her husband was 300 miles away doing the work of a world that could not keep her safe regardless. She thought about her mother's ring against her chest, about a hairbrush with half its bristles missing, about a carpet bag that had held everything she owned and had been set on this porch by a stranger's careful hands 3 weeks ago, and about how much had changed since then, and how quietly change could come when it came not as catastrophe, but as accumulation. Small choices layering over one another until one day you looked up and found yourself somewhere entirely different from where you had started. She reached up and unclasped the chain at her throat, held her mother's ring in her palm, looked at it in the dark. She had been hiding it since she was 14 years old. First in a boot, then in a coat lining, then against her skin under her collar where no one could see it and no one could think to take it. Hiding it because that was what you did when you lived inside the logic of someone who treated everything you valued as a resource to be claimed. She was not inside that logic anymore. She opened the small drawer of the bedside table and set the ring inside carefully, where it would be safe and close and available to her whenever she wanted it, but no longer hidden, no longer something she had to armor against the world. Then she closed the drawer. She crossed to the window one more time and looked down at the east wall where the rose cutting stood in its new ground, a small and unimpressive thing, by any measure bare of leaves stripped down to essential structure, showing no outward sign of what it intended to become. Tomorrow morning she would bring water to it before anything else, before the chickens, before the fence check, before the coffee was even on the stove. She would make it the first act of the day, this deliberate attention to a living thing she had chosen to tend, and she would do it not as an obligation, but as a statement about what kind of person she was deciding to be. She had spent 3 months surviving. She had spent 3 weeks fighting. Now finally she was ready to start building. Clara lay down in the east room of the Mercer ranch house and listened to the house settle into the cold of the October night around her, and underneath those sounds, the deeper quiet of a prairie that has been here longer than any of the human trouble that moves across it and will be here long after. Sleep came without effort, without dreams, just rest deep and complete the rest of a person who has finally stopped running and started building, who has arrived somewhere that does not yet feel like home, but is beginning to feel like the place where home might eventually grow from given time, given care, given the stubborn, persistent attention of two people who have both learned in their separate, painful ways that the only real answer to what has been lost is what you choose to make next. Outside in the dark, the rose cutting stood in its new ground. Its roots reached a little deeper into the Wyoming soil. It was not blooming yet, but it was alive. It was being tended. And in this country, on this ground, with this particular quality of honest, hard earth beneath it, that was the only kind of promise worth making.